Have you ever felt people become unusually interested in your life right after money enters the conversation? Because sometimes the hardest thing to admit isn't that strangers change around money. It's realizing family can change too. And that's exactly what began happening after I retired, not suddenly, not obviously, but in quiet little ways that slowly turned familiar conversations into something else entirely. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Families ask questions, families care, that's normal. But there's a difference between concern and calculation, and once you notice that difference, it becomes impossible to ignore. Have you ever sensed that someone's kindness suddenly had a purpose behind it? Because that's exactly what this felt like. Retirement was supposed to feel peaceful. Everyone always says that. After years of working, sacrificing, planning carefully, you imagine calm mornings, slower days, freedom from pressure. But no one tells you how quickly people start looking at you differently once they believe you finally have money. Have you ever realized people don't always see retirement as rest? Sometimes they see it as access. Because that realization changes every conversation afterward. It started with small comments, casual questions that sounded harmless on the surface. Have you figured out what you're doing with the retirement money? You should enjoy yourself now. You probably have more saved than you need. Little things. Nothing aggressive, nothing direct, but repeated often enough that I began noticing a pattern behind them. Have you ever noticed how people test boundaries slowly before asking for more? Because that's what I was beginning to see. Their tone changed too, that was important. Suddenly, everyone seemed more interested in my plans than they had been in years. Calls became more frequent. Family dinners happened more often. Offers to help appeared from people who previously seemed too busy to check in regularly. And maybe that should have made me happy. Maybe I should have felt cared for, but instead, something about it felt rehearsed. Have you ever felt uncomfortable around kindness because it arrived too suddenly? Because that discomfort usually means something important. I tried ignoring it at first. I didn't want to become suspicious of my own family. That kind of thought hurts before you even fully allow yourself to believe it. So I smiled, stayed polite, answered questions carefully. But quietly, I started paying attention more closely, not just to what they asked, but to when they asked it, how often money found its way into conversations, how quickly discussions about my future seemed connected to my finances rather than my happiness. Have you ever realized people ask about your well being only to circle back to your money, because that pattern becomes impossible to miss once you see it clearly? One evening during dinner, I noticed something that stayed with me long afterward. They were discussing vacations, house upgrades, future expenses, speaking casually, confidently, almost excitedly, and somewhere in the middle of the conversation, someone joked about how mom finally hit the jackpot with retirement. Everyone laughed lightly after that. Everyone except me, because underneath the joke was expectation. Have you ever heard humor reveal something people secretly mean? Because that's exactly what happened in that moment. I watched their expressions carefully afterward. No one seemed uncomfortable saying it. No one hesitated. And that told me something important. They no longer viewed my retirement money as fully mine emotionally. In their minds, it had already become family money, shared money. Available money. Have you ever realized people started spending your money mentally before you even made a decision yourself? Because that realization changes everything. I became quieter after that, not emotionally distant, but observant, very observant. And the more I listened, the more obvious certain things became. Their conversations about helping me often sounded more like discussions about managing me. Suggestions about smart financial choices somehow always benefited someone else too. And every conversation carried the same hidden assumption underneath it all that eventually I would say yes. Have you ever noticed how people become more confident when they assume you won't refuse them? Because confidence reveals intention faster than words do. Then came the moment that truly shifted something inside me. I walked into the kitchen unexpectedly one afternoon and heard just enough of a conversation to understand far more than they intended me to hear. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no obvious greed, just certainty, calm certainty. Someone mentioned what we could do once the retirement funds were properly organized. We, not me, we. Have you ever heard people speak about your money like the decision already belongs to them too? Because that single word changed everything for me. They stopped talking the second they noticed me standing there. Smiles appeared too quickly afterward. The subject changed too fast. And people only react that way when they know something shouldn't have been heard. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly understood you weren't supposed to hear the real conversation because that silence tells you more than words ever could? I smiled calmly and pretended not to notice anything, because reacting immediately would only make them more careful. And right now, careful was the last thing I wanted them to become. Have you ever stayed silent because silence gave you more information than confrontation ever would, because that silence became my greatest advantage? That night, I sat alone thinking about every conversation differently now. Every helpful suggestion, every sudden act of concern, every casual mention of my future finances. And for the first time, I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things. I wasn't. Something had changed inside this family. And slowly, painfully, I began realizing something I never thought I would need to understand about the people closest to me. They weren't just interested in my retirement, they were already imagining what they could do with it. But the next thing I overheard made me realize they weren't just talking about my retirement money anymore. They were already making plans for it behind my back. Have you ever overheard a conversation that changed the way you looked at people forever, not because they openly betrayed you, not because they said anything cruel directly to your face, but because you suddenly realized they had been thinking about your life very differently than you believed? And that's exactly what happened after that afternoon in the kitchen. Because once I started paying attention carefully, I began hearing things I could no longer ignore. Have you ever noticed how truth becomes impossible to unhear once you finally recognize it? Because that's exactly what this became. At first, I tried convincing myself they were only talking casually. Families discuss finances sometimes. People make harmless assumptions, that's normal. But there's a difference between curiosity and expectation, and little by little, their conversations stopped sounding curious. They sounded planned. Have you ever realized someone stopped wondering about your choices and started assuming them instead? Because that shift changes everything. The more I listened, the more often my retirement money appeared in conversations that had nothing to do with me directly. House repairs, debt, vacations, investments, future plans. Somehow my retirement always floated quietly underneath everything, like an invisible solution everyone had already factored into their lives. Have you ever felt like people were counting on something you never promised them? Because that feeling settles deeply once you recognize it. I stayed calm outwardly. That part mattered. I didn't challenge anyone immediately. I didn't accuse them of anything, because the moment people know you're suspicious, they become careful. And right now, they were becoming careless instead. Have you ever stayed silent because people reveal more when they think you trust them completely? Because that silence became my greatest advantage. One evening during another family dinner, the conversation drifted toward finances again. It always did eventually now, but this time something felt different, more direct, less cautious. Almost confident, someone joked about how things would finally become easier for everyone once my retirement funds were properly managed. Everyone laughed lightly afterward, everyone except me. Because underneath the joke was entitlement. Have you ever realized people reveal their true expectations through humor, because jokes often hide the truth people don't want to say openly? I watched them carefully while pretending to smile along. No one seemed uncomfortable hearing it. No one corrected the comment. No one said, "That's her decision." And that silence told me more than words ever could. Have you ever noticed that what people don't say matters just as much as what they do? Because that realization changes how you hear every conversation afterward. Then came the moment that truly shook me. A few days later, I passed by the living room late at night and heard my son and his wife talking quietly. I wasn't trying to listen intentionally at first, but then I heard my retirement mentioned again, and something in their tone made me stop. They weren't discussing possibilities anymore. They were discussing plans, actual plans. Have you ever heard people talk about your future like they already control it? Because that's exactly what this felt like. They mentioned timelines. Expenses once the money comes through, when everything gets transferred. Calm, confident phrases spoken like the outcome was already guaranteed. And then came the sentence that stayed in my mind long after the conversation ended. She doesn't really need all of it anyway. Have you ever heard someone reduce your entire lifetime of work to something they believe you should simply hand over, because that realization hurts differently? I stood there frozen for a moment, not because I was shocked anymore, but because everything suddenly became painfully clear. This wasn't concern. This wasn't family trying to help me make smart choices. This was expectation. They had already mentally divided money that still belonged entirely to me. Have you ever realized people started treating your future security like extra money waiting to be used? Because that changes the way trust feels forever. But strangely enough, the more clarity I gained, the calmer I became. Not emotionally calm, strategically calm, because once uncertainty disappears, fear starts turning into focus instead. Have you ever noticed how dangerous clarity can become? Because that clarity changed the way I moved through the house after that night. I stopped seeing casual family interactions. I started seeing positioning, influence. Pressure slowly building beneath conversations that appeared harmless on the surface. Every suggestion suddenly made sense. Every helpful discussion about financial planning carried hidden motives underneath it. Have you ever looked back at old conversations and suddenly understood what people were really trying to do? Because that's exactly what happened to me now. And perhaps the most painful realization of all was this: they genuinely believed I would eventually agree. They had become so comfortable discussing my retirement money because somewhere along the way, they stopped seeing it as fully mine emotionally. They saw it as family access waiting to happen. Have you ever realized people become entitled to things long before they legally belong to them? Because entitlement changes behavior faster than greed does. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I felt powerless, but because my mind wouldn't stop connecting everything together now. Every conversation, every smile, every sudden act of concern. And the more pieces connected, the more one truth became impossible to ignore. If I stayed passive, they would slowly convince themselves that my retirement money already belonged to them. And once people believe they're entitled to something, disappointment becomes dangerous. Have you ever realized expectations can turn people into strangers? Because that realization changed everything for me. I sat quietly in the dark that night, listening to the silence inside the house, and for the first time since retiring, I stopped thinking about peace, comfort, or family harmony. I started thinking about protection, my protection, because if they were already planning my money behind my back, then I needed to start making decisions they would never expect. And that's when I stopped trusting their kindness completely and quietly began preparing a move that would shock the entire family. What if the people closest to you weren't waiting for your happiness, but waiting for your permission? Because once money enters family conversations, something dangerous can happen slowly. Care starts sounding rehearsed. Concern starts feeling strategic, and kindness begins arriving exactly when people want something from you. And that's exactly what I started noticing after overhearing those conversations about my retirement money. Have you ever felt someone's behavior change so subtly that it takes time before you realize it isn't genuine anymore? Because that's where I found myself. After that night, I stopped listening to words alone. I started paying attention to patterns instead, and patterns never lie for long. Have you ever noticed how people reveal their true intentions through consistency? Because the more I watched, the clearer everything became. Suddenly, everyone wanted to help me with financial decisions. Everyone had advice. Everyone had concerns about whether I would manage things alone. But strangely, none of those conversations focused on what I wanted for my future. They focused on what would make things easier for everyone else. Have you ever realized people ask about your future while secretly discussing their own? Because that realization changes how every smile feels afterward. I stayed calm. Very calm, that part mattered more than anything. Because if they realized I was seeing through them, the conversations would stop immediately, and right now they were still careless, comfortable, confident. Have you ever stayed quiet because silence let people expose themselves naturally? Because that silence became my greatest advantage. I began noticing timing too. That was important. Certain family members only called when financial topics appeared nearby. Certain visits became strangely frequent after retirement discussions started. Even simple conversations somehow found their way back toward money eventually, as if everyone was slowly circling the same hidden expectation without saying it directly. Have you ever realized people can talk around money constantly without openly asking for it because that indirect pressure feels heavier than honesty sometimes? One afternoon, my daughter casually brought up expensive home repairs she was stressed about. Another day, my son mentioned financial pressure at work. Then came conversations about grandchildren's education, unexpected bills, rising costs, future security, all delivered with carefully measured emotional weight, not requests. Not yet, just stories placed gently in front of me like seeds waiting to grow. Have you ever felt emotionally prepared for a request before anyone officially asked for anything? Because that's exactly what they were doing. And the hardest part wasn't hearing those conversations. It was realizing how coordinated everything had become without anyone needing to say it openly. They all seemed connected by the same assumption that eventually I would feel responsible for solving everyone's problems. Have you ever realized people slowly position you into guilt before asking for help because guilt is easier to manipulate than obligation? I started watching their reactions carefully whenever I avoided talking about retirement money directly. That revealed even more. There would be small moments of disappointment, quick exchanges of looks between family members, subtle frustration hidden behind polite smiles. And those tiny reactions told me something important. They weren't just hoping anymore, they were expecting. Have you ever noticed how expectations reveal themselves through disappointment? Because that's exactly what I began seeing everywhere. But instead of feeling emotional about it, I became more observant, more strategic. Because once people believe you aren't paying attention, they stop filtering themselves properly, and that's when the truth begins slipping out naturally. Have you ever watched someone become careless simply because they underestimated you? Because that became my advantage completely. One evening, I overheard another conversation that changed everything further. They were discussing future plans again, quietly but confidently, and this time my retirement money wasn't spoken about like possible help. It was discussed like incoming resources already included in family planning. Once mom decides, when everything gets organized, calm phrases, comfortable phrases, dangerous phrases. Have you ever realized people stopped asking whether you would agree and started assuming you eventually would? Because that assumption changes everything. I stood quietly outside the room listening, and for the first time, I felt something shift completely inside me, not fear, not sadness, but clarity, absolute clarity. They no longer viewed my retirement savings as my security. In their minds, it had become family expansion money, backup money, accessible money. Have you ever realized people started valuing what you have more than the life you still want to live? Because that realization hurts deeper than greed itself. But strangely enough, the clearer everything became, the stronger I felt, because uncertainty creates hesitation, clarity creates action. And now I finally understood exactly what I was dealing with. Have you ever noticed how powerful understanding becomes once denial disappears? Because that's what happened to me. I stopped hoping the situation would correct itself naturally. I stopped believing kindness would suddenly become genuine again if I waited long enough. Instead, I started preparing mentally for something much bigger: protection, real protection, not emotional boundaries, financial boundaries. Legal boundaries, actual control over my future before anyone else tried controlling it for me. Have you ever realized that the moment people start planning around your money is the moment you need to protect yourself quietly? Because that realization changes everything. I smiled through family dinners after that. I listened calmly to every helpful suggestion. I allowed them to believe I still trusted every word they said. And because of that, they became even more confident, even more relaxed, even more convinced they were slowly getting exactly what they wanted. But what they didn't realize was this: while they were busy planning how to use my retirement money, I had already started planning something they would never see coming. Because while they thought I was slowly giving them access to my future, I had already begun making one quiet decision that would shock the entire family. What if the strongest move you can make is the one nobody notices until it's already finished? Because people prepare for arguments, they prepare for emotional reactions, they even prepare for resistance. But they rarely prepare for silence combined with planning, and that's exactly where I found myself now, not angry anymore, not confused, but focused in a way my family never expected. Have you ever realized that once trust breaks quietly, your mind stops reacting emotionally and starts protecting itself instead? Because that's exactly what happened to me. By this point, I no longer questioned what they were doing. I already understood it clearly: the fake concern, the carefully timed conversations, the emotional stories placed in front of me like subtle pressure. It all pointed toward the same thing: access. Access to my retirement money, my security, my future. Have you ever realized people can slowly turn your financial stability into part of their own life plan? Because that realization changes everything. But instead of confronting them immediately, I became calmer, much calmer. That part surprised even me. Because once you stop hoping people will change, you start thinking more clearly about what you need to do next. Have you ever noticed how clarity removes fear? Because fear had slowly disappeared from me now. In its place was something else entirely: preparation. I stayed exactly the same on the outside. That mattered. I smiled during family dinners. I listened politely when they talked about smart financial decisions. I nodded calmly when they suggested helping manage things. And because I looked cooperative, they relaxed even more. Have you ever let people believe they were influencing you simply so they would stop being careful? Because that became my greatest advantage. Their confidence grew quickly after that. I could see it in the way conversations became more direct, less cautious, more emotionally comfortable. They genuinely believed they were slowly moving me toward the decision they wanted, and that belief made them careless. Have you ever noticed how dangerous confidence becomes when it's based entirely on assumptions? Because every assumption they made pushed me further ahead without them realizing it. Meanwhile, I quietly started organizing my own thoughts differently, not emotionally, strategically. I began reviewing everything carefully: financial accounts, retirement structures, ownership details, long term security plans. Things I had managed responsibly for years without anyone paying close attention to before. But now I needed to pay attention very carefully. Have you ever realized the moment people become interested in your money is the moment you need to fully understand your own control over it? Because that realization changes how you move. I didn't rush anything. That was important. Fast, emotional decisions create mistakes, and mistakes were something I couldn't afford now. Every step needed to be thoughtful, quiet, invisible until the exact moment it mattered. Have you ever prepared something so carefully that nobody noticed it happening until it was too late? Because that became my goal completely. I started making calls privately, asking questions casually instead of urgently, gathering information without revealing concern, and the more information I gathered, the calmer I became. Because understanding gives you power people can't see from the outside. Have you ever noticed how calm someone becomes once they finally know exactly what they're doing? Because that calmness changed me completely. I stopped feeling emotionally trapped inside their expectations. Instead, I started realizing something important. Their entire confidence depended on me staying passive, staying trusting, staying predictable. Have you ever realized someone's plan only works if you never change your behavior? Because once you change, their entire strategy begins collapsing quietly. That realization gave me strength they never expected me to have. While they talked about future spending, future plans, future financial possibilities, I quietly focused on something much more important: ownership, control, boundaries, security, real security, not emotional reassurance. Actual protection. Have you ever realized peace doesn't come from trusting people blindly? It comes from protecting yourself properly, because that understanding changed everything for me. And strangely enough, the more prepared I became, the less emotional I felt toward them. Not because I stopped loving my family, but because I finally saw the situation clearly. They weren't treating my retirement money as my safety anymore. They were treating it as opportunity. And once people begin seeing opportunity where your security should be, you must act carefully. Have you ever realized the people closest to you can accidentally become the greatest threat to your peace? Because that realization hurts deeply, but it also wakes you up completely. One evening after another family dinner filled with subtle financial hints and carefully disguised pressure, I sat alone quietly reviewing the final details of the decision I had been preparing. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt since retirement began: relief, real relief. Because while my family believed they were slowly guiding me toward their plans, I had already completed the move that would change everything before they even realized what happened. And while they were already mentally spending my retirement money, I had just made one quiet decision that was about to shock the entire family. What happens when people believe your decision is already made? Because once expectation turns into certainty, behavior changes completely. And that's exactly what started happening inside my family after weeks of subtle conversations, careful emotional pressure, and quiet assumptions about my retirement money. Because by now, they no longer acted like they were hoping for access. They acted like access was inevitable. Have you ever watched people become more confident simply because they think you'll never say no? Because that confidence changes the way they treat you. The tone inside family conversations shifted first. That was important. Suggestions became stronger. Advice became more direct. And suddenly, everyone seemed deeply concerned about how I was handling things financially, even though I had managed my own life perfectly well for decades before retirement ever happened. Have you ever noticed how people suddenly question your judgment when money becomes involved? Because that realization reveals more than greed ever could. My son especially had changed. The hesitation he once carried during financial discussions slowly disappeared, replaced by calm certainty. as though he genuinely believed he was already stepping into a leadership role over decisions that still belonged entirely to me. Have you ever seen someone slowly move from asking to assuming authority instead? Because that shift changes everything. He began bringing up practical plans more often now, future investments, family needs, long term shared security, everything framed carefully to sound responsible instead of controlling. But underneath every conversation was the same hidden assumption: they believed my retirement money would eventually become part of their lives. Have you ever listened to people discuss your future while realizing they're actually discussing their own? Because that realization changes how every conversation feels afterward. I stayed calm through all of it. That part mattered more than ever now, because by this point, reacting emotionally would only create conflict before the right moment arrived, and I wasn't interested in emotional arguments anymore. I was interested in timing. Have you ever realized timing matters more than emotion when protecting yourself? Because that understanding kept me steady. One evening during dinner, the pressure finally became more visible than before. It wasn't hidden behind jokes or subtle comments anymore. My son began speaking openly about how families should support each other and how retirement money should be used wisely instead of sitting untouched. Everyone nodded quietly during the conversation, and suddenly I realized something unsettling. They had already discussed this privately many times without me. Have you ever entered a conversation and realized everyone else already agreed on something involving you? Because that feeling changes trust permanently. His wife started mentioning specific financial ideas after that. Educational costs, property upgrades, future family plans, not framed as requests, of course, framed as important things the family could finally achieve together. Together, that word stayed with me. Have you ever noticed how people use emotional language to disguise financial expectations? Because emotional pressure is harder to confront directly. I listened quietly while they spoke, watching how comfortable they had become discussing my retirement money as though it already existed inside family planning. And the strangest part was this: they no longer seemed aware of how entitled they sounded. That's what confidence does. It normalizes behavior people once would have hidden. Have you ever seen people stop hearing themselves clearly once they become too comfortable with their own expectations? Because that's exactly what was happening now. Then came the moment that confirmed everything for me completely. My son leaned back calmly during the conversation and said, "We just want to make sure the money is being used properly while it still matters." While it still matters. Have you ever heard someone speak about your future like your remaining time has already become part of their calculations? Because that sentence changed something inside me permanently. For a second, the room felt very quiet, not because anyone reacted strongly, but because deep down everyone understood exactly what had been said. And still, nobody corrected it. Nobody defended me. Nobody reminded him that the retirement money still belonged entirely to me. Have you ever noticed how silence can expose agreement better than words? Because that silence revealed everything. But even then, I didn't react emotionally. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. Because by this point, I had already moved beyond trying to convince them to respect me. Instead, I focused on something much more important: protecting myself before their expectations became demands. Have you ever realized there comes a moment when explanation stops mattering and action becomes necessary instead? Because that's exactly where I was now. I answered calmly, saying I was still thinking carefully about my future plans. And immediately, I noticed frustration flash across several faces around the table before polite expressions quickly returned. That reaction told me more than words ever could. They weren't simply hoping anymore. They were waiting, waiting for me to finally give them what they already emotionally believed belonged to them. Have you ever seen disappointment appear when people don't receive something you never promised in the first place? Because entitlement creates expectations faster than reality ever should. Later that night, after everyone went to sleep, I sat quietly reviewing everything that had happened over the past few weeks: the fake concern, the emotional pressure, the carefully disguised financial expectations. And for the first time, I felt absolutely certain about one thing. They believed they were slowly gaining control over my future. But what they didn't know was that I had already changed everything without telling them. Completely. Because while my family was busy planning how to use my retirement money, they had no idea I had already made the decision that would shock every one of them. What if one quiet decision could completely change the future people already imagined for themselves? because sometimes the biggest shock doesn't come from yelling, arguments, or emotional confrontation. It comes from calm certainty. From realizing too late that the person you underestimated was several steps ahead the entire time. And that's exactly what happened when my family finally discovered what I had done with my retirement money. By then, I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't emotionally trapped between guilt and pressure. I was clear, completely clear. Have you ever reached a point where your mind becomes calmer because you finally know exactly what needs to happen next? Because that clarity changes everything. The weeks leading up to that moment felt strangely normal on the surface. Family dinners continued. Conversations kept circling around future plans, financial responsibility, helping the family, and all the familiar phrases they had repeated so many times that they almost sounded rehearsed now. But underneath those conversations, I could feel something changing. Their patience was shrinking. Have you ever noticed how people become more direct when they believe they've waited long enough for what they expect? Because that's exactly what was happening now. They genuinely believed I was slowly moving toward the decision they wanted. My calmness had convinced them of that. My silence had reassured them. And the more confident they became, the less careful they sounded. Have you ever watched someone mistake patience for surrender? Because that mistake became my greatest advantage. Then came the dinner that changed everything. At first, it felt like every other evening recently: casual conversation, polite smiles, subtle mentions of financial concerns woven naturally into family discussions. But this time, there was a different energy underneath it all: anticipation, expectation, as if they believed the final answer was finally coming. Have you ever sat in a room where everyone seemed emotionally prepared for a decision you hadn't actually made? Because that tension becomes impossible to ignore. My son eventually brought the conversation toward retirement again, this time more confidently than ever before. He started discussing smart next steps and family stability, speaking carefully but with obvious certainty beneath every word, and for the first time, he openly asked when I planned to organize the retirement money properly. Have you ever noticed how people redefine your choices once they believe they deserve influence over them? Because that single word revealed everything. I looked around the table quietly after he said it. Everyone was watching me now, waiting calm on the surface, expectant underneath. And in that moment, I realized something painful but important. They no longer saw this as my personal decision. Emotionally, they already believed the outcome belonged to the family. Have you ever realized people can become emotionally attached to money that was never theirs? Because that attachment changes behavior in dangerous ways. I stayed calm for several seconds before answering. That pause mattered. Because sometimes silence changes a room before words even arrive. Have you ever noticed how quickly confidence becomes nervousness when expectations are interrupted? Because that's exactly what happened. Then finally I spoke, calmly. Clearly, without anger, I explained that I had already made my financial decisions privately and finalized everything weeks ago. The room went completely still after that, not confused at first, just still. Because nobody expected those words. Have you ever watched certainty disappear from people's faces in real time? Because that's exactly what I saw sitting around that table. My son blinked quickly, clearly trying to process what I had said. His wife looked at him immediately, searching for reassurance that didn't exist anymore. And for the first time in weeks, I saw uncertainty, real uncertainty. Have you ever seen people realize they misunderstood the situation completely? Because that realization changes everything instantly. The questions came quickly after that, too quickly. What decisions? Why hadn't I discussed them first? What exactly had I done? But underneath every question was the same truth. They were no longer asking out of concern. They were panicking because the future they imagined was suddenly collapsing. Have you ever realized people reveal their true emotions the moment expectations break apart? Because that's when honesty finally appears. I answered calmly, explaining only what they needed to know: that my retirement money had already been secured exactly the way I wanted, under terms I trusted, for purposes I personally chose. Not family pressure, not emotional guilt. My choice, completely my choice. Have you ever seen people struggle with the idea that they never actually controlled the outcome at all? Because that's exactly what this moment became. The disappointment in the room was impossible to hide now, not because anyone openly admitted expecting access to my retirement money, but because their reactions exposed what words no longer could: frustration, shock, hurt pride, confusion, all sitting openly around the table now. And strangely enough, seeing those reactions didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel clear. because for the first time, there was no pretending anymore. Have you ever realized painful truth feels lighter than fake kindness? Because that's exactly how this felt. I sat there calmly while the reality slowly settled over everyone. The retirement money they had already mentally planned around was never actually available to them at all. And in that moment, the balance inside the family changed completely, not through anger, through clarity. But even after they learned the truth, what my family said next hurt more than every hidden conversation I overheard before. What hurts more than people wanting your money is realizing they truly believed they deserved it, because greed alone is painful, but entitlement changes something deeper. It changes the way people look at you, the way they value your choices, the way they slowly stop seeing you as an independent person and start seeing you as access to something they already emotionally claimed. And that painful realization became impossible to ignore after my family learned what I had done with my retirement money. The room stayed quiet for several seconds after I explained everything, but it wasn't peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that appears when expectations collapse too quickly for people to hide their real emotions immediately. Have you ever watched people process disappointment while trying not to reveal how much they expected from you? Because that's exactly what I saw sitting around that table. My son looked stunned at first, but not simply because I had made financial decisions privately. It was deeper than that. He looked shocked because, in his mind, he truly believed he should have been part of those decisions. Have you ever realized someone stopped seeing your choices as fully yours long before you noticed it happening? Because that realization changes everything. The questions started almost immediately after the silence broke. Why didn't I discuss it first? Why would I make such an important decision without involving the family? Didn't I trust them? And listening to those questions felt strangely surreal because for weeks I had listened to them discuss my retirement money privately without involving me at all. Have you ever noticed how people become upset by the same behavior they showed you first? Because that irony reveals the truth faster than arguments ever could. I answered calmly, not emotionally, not defensively. Because by this point, I no longer felt confused about what was happening. I simply felt clear. I explained that after working my entire life, I wanted to make sure my retirement remained secure under decisions I personally controlled. That was all, nothing cruel, nothing dramatic, just honesty. But honesty sounds very different to people once expectations have already formed. Have you ever realized disappointment changes how people hear your words? Because that disappointment was sitting openly across from me now. My son tried explaining himself after that, saying they were only trying to help, that they were thinking about the family, that everyone simply wanted to make smart decisions together. Together, that word again. Have you ever noticed how people use togetherness to justify access to things that were never fully theirs? Because emotional language can hide entitlement very well. But then came the sentence that hurt more than every secret conversation, every fake smile, every hidden assumption combined. My son looked at me with visible frustration and quietly said, "We thought you trusted us, trusted us." As if protecting my own future meant betrayal against the family. Have you ever realized people sometimes call boundaries lack of trust because boundaries stop access they expected to have? Because that realization changes the way you understand manipulation forever. For a moment, I just looked at him quietly, not angry anymore, not even shocked, because suddenly everything made sense in a painful way. They genuinely didn't fully understand what they had done wrong. Somewhere along the way, they convinced themselves that wanting my retirement money for family needs made their expectations reasonable, practical, even loving. Have you ever realized people can hurt you deeply while still believing they're good people? Because that realization changes how you see relationships permanently. I told him something simple after that. I said trust doesn't mean giving people control over your future. Trust doesn't mean sacrificing your own security to meet expectations nobody should have formed in the first place. And most importantly, love should never make someone feel guilty for protecting themselves. Have you ever realized real love respects your boundaries instead of pressuring them? Because that understanding changed everything for me. The room became quiet again after that, but differently this time. Less defensive, less emotional, almost reflective. And for the first time since retirement started, I felt like everyone was finally seeing the situation clearly, not through financial expectations, not through emotional pressure, but through truth. Have you ever noticed how clarity changes the atmosphere in a room completely? Because that's exactly what happened. I didn't feel victorious sitting there. That's important. This was never about winning against my family. It was about protecting myself before I slowly disappeared inside other people's plans for my future. And finally, after weeks of pressure and hidden expectations, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace, real peace. Because my future no longer depended on guilt, pressure, or emotional manipulation. It depended on my own decisions again. Have you ever realized freedom sometimes comes from saying no, even when people around you expected yes? Because that freedom changes you completely. Later that night, after everyone left and the house became quiet again, I sat alone thinking about everything that had happened, not with bitterness, not with anger, but with understanding. Retirement had taught me something I never expected to learn so late in life. Sometimes the people closest to you don't slowly become greedy. Sometimes they slowly become entitled. And entitlement is dangerous because it disguises itself as love, concern, practicality, and family responsibility, until one day you realize your own future no longer feels fully yours anymore. But thankfully, I realized it before it was too late. They thought my retirement money belonged to the family until they learned it still belonged to me and always would.